And welcome everybody to our informal coffee chat on reproductive justice with our colleagues in British Columbia. I'm happy to have everyone over this evening. For those of you who have not met me, I'm Anna Popovich, Program Director at Humanist Canada. So we will meet for 1 hour and sort of we'll have a formal presentation or short presentation at the beginning, and then we'll open it up to a discussion. So I'm pleased to welcome our British Columbia colleagues. As I said, the Humanist Association of BC has been doing great work on the separation of church and state, as well as reproductive justice. And I would like to mention that Humanist Canada has just endorsed BCHA's petition to eliminate prayers in the House of Commons. So I invite all of you to support this joint effort, and I'll put the link to the petition campaign in the chat in a second. And this evening, we will be discussing BCHA's work on the state of abortion access and reproductive rights in British Columbia. And some of you probably know this is not a new topic for us. In 2019, in partnership with the Ontario Coalition of Abortion Clinics, Humanist Canada launched a Dr. Morgentaler Memorial Scholarship that awards $1,000 to a physician intending to become an abortion service provider in Canada. Of course, we all know that Dr. Morgentaler was a pioneering pro-abortion physician who challenged the Supreme Court of Canada in an effort to decriminalize abortion and spend time in jail defending a cause that we now take for granted here, hopefully still, although not so much in the US anymore. So welcome, Ian and the team. Ian Bushfield is the executive director of the BCHA, British Columbia Humanist Association. He has been involved in the association since 2009. Ian has a background in physics and nonprofit management. And in 2017, he also joined the BC Civil Liberties Association's board of directors. So it's great to have you with us. So the mic over to you.
All right,
thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. It's great to be able to chat with so many people on this lovely, what is today, Thursday afternoon, evening, wherever you are. And I hope it is lovely weather where you are. It's like a perfect fall day here in the West Coast. I do want to acknowledge that I'm coming from the traditional and unceded territories of the Coquitlam peoples. Those are the lands just outside Metro, or within Metro Vancouver in Coquitlam. My colleagues Olivia and Pratiga are here with me in the chat, and I will throw it over to them a little bit later to talk about some of the current research we're doing. I also want to acknowledge that on a topic like reproductive justice, I obviously have a very specific perspective that's not necessarily always the most, directly impacted, I think is the best way to put it. I'm, clearly a cisgender, heterosexual male. I do have 2 kids, so the questions around that we'll be talking about have come up within our own family. But bodily autonomy is not under threat for me in the same way it is for so many other people in the world. And that's where we'll get to, I think, with the idea of reproductive justice beyond just what we've kind of, I think, traditionally talked about as humanism. So Anna talked about Dr. Henry Morgentaler, and I did want to start there because this idea of abortion rights in Canada is so tied into the history of humanism in Canada. Dr. Henry Morgentaler, as for those who weren't aware of his full background, was an Auschwitz survivor, a Holocaust survivor. He made it to Canada and got his medical degree and really just started trying to be a keep his head in the sand kind of doctor, it sounds like. But at some point he got involved in humanism in the 1960s, helped co-found Humanist Canada. I think he was involved in the Humanist Fellowship of Montreal. And in 1967 or 68, he was before Parliament testifying that we shouldn't have an abortion law. And he really believed that based on his humanism. And it was his commitments to bodily autonomy and the rights of all people to make those decisions for themselves. That led a lot of people to reach out to him asking if he would perform an abortion for them. And at that time it was illegal and he wasn't sure. And as someone, in his 40s at the time, I think, really didn't want to shake the boat, but then realized that he had to put his principles where his mouth was and started doing it, and really just fought it all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. All through this, he also talked about, how this was deeply connected to humanism. In 1973, it was when the Second Humanist Manifesto was launched by the American Humanist Association. He was a co-signer on that. That explicitly calls for the right to abortion. He was named American Humanist Association's Humanist of the Year in 1975. And the quotes from him, if you haven't seen them, are all kind of deeply tying that belief in secular morality and secular ethics with the right to bodily autonomy, particularly for women. He said at one point, "I decided to break the law to provide a necessary medical service because women were dying at the hands of butchers and incompetent quacks, and there was no one there to help them. The law was barbarous, cruel, and unjust." And he would later talk about why he fought so hard for abortion. He said, that he supported well-loved children. He supported the idea of a good family, and he said, "Well-loved children grow into adults who do not build concentration camps, do not rape, and do not murder." That's not to say that, having abortion rights guarantees you don't get bad things in the world, but I think the flip is more concerning. One of the things that happened, though, over the last few years and few decades, though, is an increasing awareness that the fight for abortion rights was largely led by fairly well-off white people, and largely women, but there were white men as well, like Dr. Henry Morgentaler. And so there was this international conference on reproductive health and population in 1994, and a group of Black women in Chicago wanted to challenge some of the issues there. They would form a group called the Women of African Descent for Reproductive Justice. It's now known as Sister Song, and it's quite a prominent activist organization in the US. And they defined the term, they coined the term in 1994, reproductive justice, and they defined it as the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, have children, not have children, and parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. So it's beyond just that right to an abortion, but it's also that right to have a family, should you choose it. And that's, the route my family has gone. But these questions all come up, and it's more than just, having children or not having children. It's being able to raise children, should you choose to do that. In the discussion of the history of Sister Song, they describe it as they recognize that the women's rights movements led by and representing middle-class and wealthy white women could not defend the needs of women of color and other marginalized and trans people. We need to lead our own national movement to uplift the needs of the most marginalized women, families, and communities. So this shift from reproductive freedom, reproductive rights to reproductive justice is kind of going from the idea of, just making sure there is access to making sure there is choice, and to making sure that full suite of coverage and support is there for all people in all communities. And so earlier this year, as you'll know, the Supreme Court of the United States decided to go down the darkest path and darkest timeline in the Dobbs decision, and I don't need to recap that. But as the leaked memo or the leaked decision was getting out, BCHA connected with a few other organizations in Metro Vancouver, the Abortion Rights Coalition, which is led by Joyce Arthur, who's a longtime member of the BCHA, and I believe Humanist Canada, Access BC, which is led by Dr. Teal Phelps Bondaroff, who also works with us, and campaigns for free contraceptive access, Options for Sexual Health, which is formerly Planned Parenthood of BC, and the UBC Social Justice Center. We all came together and held a rally for reproductive justice. And then we planned a second follow-up of what do we do when the decision actually drops. And our decision was to launch a manifesto, a statement saying, what are the limits on healthcare and reproductive healthcare in Canada? Because while we're seeing the rollback in the US, it's not enough to just say, we're doing great here. You can still technically get an abortion in Canada. It's not that simple. And a lot of the work we've really been working on at the BCHA, among other things, has been on trying to document how difficult it is in many different ways. And a lot of organizations are doing this. I think Jill on the call is with the National Abortion Federation, if I'm not mistaken, and they've done amazing work, obviously, Action Canada nationally and the Abortion Rights Coalition. So we're not alone in this, and we're not taking credit for all of this, but I will just speak to the little bit we've done. So the manifesto we launched is at reproductivejustice.ca. No one had bought that domain, so I bought it. And now we can have our little landing page there for that. And maybe we'll do something more with that in the future. We tried to come up with what are the calls to action? What are the limits in Canada? A big one we wanted to focus on was rural and remote area access to reproductive health care and abortion access. We know that if you're in Vancouver, Montreal, or Toronto, you could get an abortion. It's pretty straightforward, standard. You talk to your GP, you talk to the clinic. There are clinics around. You get into northern BC, northern Alberta, northern Ontario, any of these more remote communities, Indigenous communities especially, and there aren't clinics there. We're trying to do documentation on how the public clinics are working in BC, and it's difficult. There aren't many hospitals, and the hospitals that are supposed to be providing it, it's not even clear if they are doing it and where they're referring to people. So if you're 4 hours outside of Vancouver, if you're 10 hours outside of Toronto, do you still have the same level of access, especially if, say, you're a 17-year-old teenager who's scared and comes with a conservative family? So, promoting that access is super important for us. And this also extends to the recently approved mifepristone. I always screw up the pronunciation. These new pills, the morning after type pills and the RU486 pills to help. And that access to that is not as widespread as it should be. On the other side of the pregnancy spectrum is that free and universal contraceptive care. This is what Access BC has been asking for quite a while, is for provincial medical insurance plans to cover things like the birth control pill, IUDs, which can cost hundreds of dollars and are often uncovered, but a vasectomy might be covered. So we can extend these services and coverage and really just help people in many different ways. Access BC has done a ton of great work on this, and I highly encourage you to check out their website and write your politicians. I think they're mostly focused on BC given the name, but you can copy their letter and send it to your own MLA, MPP, or representative, as it were. Another big focus is comprehensive sexual health education, so sex ed in schools. We've done a little bit of talking about this in BC, and I know Ontario talks about it a lot, and both have things that are promising, but ensuring that kids are getting the education they need, whether it's in public schools, the Catholic separate schools in Ontario, and private schools wherever else, is really important. We know that a lot of anti-choice organizations are trying to provide sex ed courses for schools, and that's worrying, because where is the official curriculum on all of this? Coming back to the reproductive justice and the full kind of cradle to the grave coverage of all of your choices, universal childcare is a key component of this. We're starting to see this roll out across Canada thanks to the work of many different levels of government and a lot of activists for a lot of years calling for the need for universal childcare, and it's making a difference. So good to see that. As well, making sure all healthcare is trans and gender inclusive. A lot of the language that I'll be trying to use and that you'll see these days doesn't always necessarily talk about just women, because women aren't the only people who can get pregnant, and the transphobia in our healthcare system and our society can seriously affect trans women's ability to access all of the services they need. Another big problem in Canada is that there is a lot of official formal recognition of these anti-choice groups. The federal government grants charity status to crisis pregnancy centers. These, I'll pass it over to Olivia in a second to talk a little bit more about, but these crisis pregnancy centers are essentially anti-choice fronts. They set up trying to convince people not to have an abortion and instead to go down many different routes, which is a free choice, but they use deceptive tactics and often position themselves in ways that makes them look like they're a legitimate place for information, but are often just funded by conservative religious groups. So all of that was part of our reproductive justice manifesto, as well as a little bit more. We've had quite a few organizations sign on to that at reproductivejustice.ca, from small little community groups to just recently they finally got around to passing it through their internal bureaucracy. Unifor, the largest public sector or private sector union in Canada, signed on to it. So that was a big step forward. And these are the kind of calls we want to see politicians move forward. Some of these are in the works. Childcare is in the works. The federal Liberals have promised to end the charity status for crisis pregnancy centers, but they haven't clearly done it yet. So some of the things is on the agenda and others needs to continue to be moved forward. And a big chunk of it was just making sure that when all of the news was coming down out of the States, we could make sure that momentum was captured in Canada to continue to move forward reproductive rights and reproductive justice for everyone here. And one of the other things I want to just draw attention to is, it was flagged to me, I had missed it when we were drafting the original, but in a few years ago, the 50th anniversary of the abortion caravan happened. This was a big movement in the history of abortion rights in Canada. And to commemorate that, I think it was Action Canada put this website together. They launched a number of different statements, including the Decolonize Abortion Care list of demands in Canada. And that one named a number of specific issues facing Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited people. The right to choice in Indigenous communities is particularly notable, as up until even the very recent history in the last couple of years, there are still stories of Indigenous women being forcibly sterilized against their will in this country. It's come out in Saskatchewan and elsewhere. The right to not have children, the right to have an abortion, is just as up there with the right to have children. Of course, I don't think any of us would disagree with that. And so all of this ties together. We have no problem. We support all of those kind of demands as well. And that's where I think all the humanism is trying to come together behind this movement. But I want to also give a chance to talk about some of the work we are doing. So maybe I'll turn it over to Olivia Jensen. Olivia Jensen and Pratika Chowdhury are two of our summer interns. Well, they're now staff members. They were staff members who have been working with us through the summer. They were hired on Canada Summer Jobs Grants, and our generous donors have enabled us to keep them around for a bit longer, and hopefully longer after that. bchumanist.ca/donate. They are social policy researchers who are looking into prayers in municipalities, as well as crisis pregnancy centers and everything else we're digging into. So I'll let Olivia talk a little bit about our work on crisis pregnancy centers, if she's still there. I think she may have frozen. I might let Pratika, who is over in Toronto, if you're up for it. I don't know how much you prepped.
I have not prepped at all.
Okay. Oh, Olivia's back. I'll let Olivia do the talking then.
I'm so sorry, everyone. I moved upstairs for better Wi-Fi, and it seems that is not the case. I might try turning my video off just to see if that helps me stay more connected, and so my talking doesn't get broken up too much. So we have two major things that we're working on right now. We have our report on the BC crisis pregnancy centers, and we've currently identified 23 in BC as of now. And in the report, we're basically making baseball cards for local advocates to look at, and they can identify any problematic funding they've been receiving, like federal wage subsidies, or from pro-life organizations or things like that. The services that they provide, and then their location and proximity to hospitals and clinics, and then larger affiliations to like Birthright or Heartbeat International, pro-life, things like this. And two themes that I was going to point out that I think are very problematic in BC are basically CPC and clinic hybrids. So we've seen two of these now that have opened up in BC. And what's problematic about that is that they're offering things like STI services and pap smear tests And when you look up a clinic in your area, they'll actually pop up. So that is really problematic because it already, I mean, crisis pregnancy centers are already trying to make themselves seem as legitimate medical institutions. So the fact that they're literally labeling themselves as clinics is even more problematic. And it's interesting too that they're getting volunteer nurses to work at these clinics. So that's something I want to look into further as well. How is that working? And another thing too that we've noticed is there is now online crisis pregnancy centers. And there's one actually run by the Christian Advocacy Society of Vancouver, and it's called onlinecare.ca. And basically it's just a crisis pregnancy center, but they're online. So they're very easy to access. And if you're, you know, a younger person and you're obviously online, you can chat or call with them 24 hours. And that's also very problematic because it's very easy to access. And I think that would definitely, if you were someone in that situation, you were younger, you'd be more likely to probably chat with someone or call online versus go in person, not that people don't. And then another thing that we've found is that there's, I'm sure you guys have heard of this, it's Rachel's Vineyard, and they're basically a post-abortion recovery seminar program. They kind of run around the rhetoric of the shame of your abortion. They'll help you heal from that. They're really big in the States, but there is one here in Kelowna. And there's actually another one that's just opened up as well. It's affiliated, but not necessarily called by the same name, and they're in Smithers. So that is another thing that we're seeing on the rise, unfortunately. We've identified 5 crisis pregnancy centers so far that have received federal wage subsidies in the past 10 years. And one of them actually is the clinics, and they've received actually a $50,000 gaming grant from the provincial government. And I think that was in 2020, so it was very recent. And I tried to look into what they used the gaming grant for. I was unsuccessful in that, but that is a very large chunk of money that they are receiving from the government. And that obviously is inherently problematic that the government is funding organizations such as these. And another thing that we've been looking at as well is these crisis pregnancy centers, a lot of them actually have sex ed programs. So they're going into schools, public and private, and putting on presentations to normally middle school to high school age children. We haven't really found any evidence of them going into elementary schools and talking about a variety of things, but a major theme is they like to talk about sexual integrity. And so they don't really get into too much about abstinence, but it's kind of insinuated in there that that's a bit of a similar rhetoric. And we've also seen in some of the testimonials of these sex ed programs that they actually are talking about their crisis pregnancy centers in the schools. So children that they've gotten testimonials from, and teachers as well, literally name the crisis pregnancy center in their testimonial. So it's not, because some of them have like aliases like share or stand up or whatever that is, to kind of take away from the fact that it's the crisis pregnancy center giving the talk, but they actually are talking about their crisis pregnancy centers in the schools, which is really, really bad. And some of the testimonials were like, oh, I know where to go if I'm ever in this situation. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's terrible. They definitely should not be doing that. So that is some of kind of the major findings that we found so far for our crisis pregnancy center report. I don't know if Ratiga wants to pop in if I missed anything important. If not, I'll pop on to the next thing we're kind of working on.
I might give like a particularly egregious example, and Olivia briefly spoke about Rachel's Vineyard, which is almost like a getaway for people who have had abortions or people whose partners have had abortions, and they sell it as a resort. At a recovery resort. And one thing that I found like particularly jarring is that they have this specific program for men to mourn their unborn child. So say their partner got an abortion against their will, they sort of have this space very like specific to men. Yeah, and that's like one example that I found really jarring.
Yeah, that's definitely that's a jarring one. And I'm looking at another thing I forgot to mention as well. A lot of these CPCs are usually affiliated with, not all of them, but I've found a good chunk of them are affiliated with their local diocese, like Catholic diocese. And there was one actually, I think this was somewhere in the Okanagan. They were linked to a CPC, and they also had this program called spiritual adoption. And what it said was they have apparently all these lists of babies who are unborn that are at risk of being aborted. And you can pick one and pray for it every day in hopes that it won't be. And so they call it a spiritual adoption, which I was very shocked when I was reading that. So now I'll move on to kind of the second thing that we're working on right now. And so Ian kind of touched on this a little bit. But here in BC, I'm not sure what it is throughout the other provinces, but we have a thing called Schedule A. So these are all the hospitals that are legally mandated in BC to provide abortions. And so we had started looking into just researching every single one of these hospitals and seeing how easy it was to find information about their abortion services, what they're providing. And what I had found was basically nothing. Very little information on any of those types of services. A lot of hospitals will have a list of all the medical services that they provide, and reproductive health is never really ever listed. The closest thing I found was maternity for some. So that was pretty disheartening. So this kind of led us this idea to start calling hospitals and just asking them on this list, hey, do you provide medical and or surgical abortions? And so far we've called, I think, about half. And I know Pratiga had a really rough day. Her first couple of calls didn't go the best. First and foremost, so when you call these hospitals, I'm sure as a lot of you may know, you have to go through kind of the automated person. They're like, okay, press 1 for this, press 2 for that. And it was just hard to figure out which number to press if you were in that situation. There was never a number or a line that was associated with, reproductive health or anything like that. So I'd oftentimes have to sit there and listen to them list all the numbers off multiple times till I could figure out which one was the most relevant, which I thought was pretty sad. And then so you finally would pick one, and Pratiga ended up getting, I think she ended up getting transferred like 5 different times, correct me if I'm wrong, in one of her first calls. And then they had ended up referring her to a clinic near the hospital that they believed to be providing abortions. And when she called this clinic, they didn't really answer the question about it, started bumbling, and then hung up on her. So that was really, really sad to hear, because obviously we're not in that situation. We're posing as people who are, but if you were to be in that situation, that's a very tender phone call to be making in that, that situation in your life. And so to be treated that way by medical staff is really sad. Not all the calls were that sad, but it's sad that it even happened once. Oftentimes, they normally didn't have a doctor actually on site that was providing them. they usually had a number to somebody else that they knew, and then they would give it to you, and then you would call them. And it would be at a separate clinic somewhere or a private practice, which I thought was interesting as well, as these hospitals are obviously supposed to be providing them. So that was really interesting and sad. And then trying to think, am I missing anything, Pratika?
I think someone in the comment mentioned that nurse practitioners are allowed to provide medical abortions, and that's true, which is why this is even more worrying, is that we initially started the question with, do you provide medical abortions? And the secondary question was, do you provide surgical abortions? And a lot of these hospitals don't even provide medical abortions. So that's just the pill. That's just providing like an abortion pill. And they still aren't providing that service, even though they're legally mandated to. And I assume it's a lot less complex than, you know, conducting a surgery. So it's very intentional, I think. Just so far, it's very intentional, their lack of service when it comes to abortion.
I'll just give some of the background as well as we think about it. Like, we know there are lists of where all of the abortion clinics are in BC. Some of that information is public. Options for Sexual Health is a great resource, and it has a lot of information. But we also know that, especially outside the major centers, the official lists aren't complete. There are doctors in these communities. There are ways to get abortions in these communities. Not illegal ways, just they aren't very publicized because of the fear. The fear exists in Canada of anti-choice violence. And that is kind of the message here. What actually motivated us to start looking at these hospitals is we know there are religious hospitals, Catholic hospitals in BC funded that get full funding from the public healthcare system. This includes St. Paul's Hospital in downtown Vancouver and a number of other major facilities. And we know they don't provide abortions, and we know they were given an opt-out from it. But when they were given an opt-out, the idea was that the public ones would at least do it. And so we said, well, are the public ones doing it? And so we're trying to figure that out. We think they probably are, but they might just also be too afraid to tell us over the phone, which is its own problem, of course, because you have to, again, imagine that situation of the 15, 16, 17-year-old who is afraid and needs some help and doesn't want to talk to her parents. And kids probably aren't calling hospitals these days. We recognize that at least. But it's not like the information's on their websites either. And so this is a big issue that we're finding. And Jill is completely right. You know, the stigma in the comments. Even the other day, taking the SkyTrain into downtown Vancouver, one of the stations I went by had a billboard up that just said, like, look up the pro-life, or what was it, the Life Society of Canada. And it, when you finally look them up, is a explicitly anti-choice organization. But there are, these crisis pregnancy centers have ads on transit. Abortion Rights Canada has tried to fight these and have them restricted. And there's been a few court cases that go either way. And I think TransLink here in BC has taken a more free speech position, that they'll just put a little disclaimer at the bottom. But maybe it's time to start putting up advertisements that say abortion is good. And that might be what we fundraise for next. You know, it's okay. It's good. But yeah, sorry to cut you off, Pratika. I just wanted to kind of give that background. So we are still concerned about the religious hospitals, obviously. We're the Humanist organization. We don't like them, other than, like, the people who work there are generally secular and good, but the bishops who sit on their boards are, you know, Catholic bishops who shouldn't be sitting on the board of something that gets public funding. So that's kind of what motivated us, and we are concerned with that. But yeah, was there anything else we wanted to add on our ongoing work? All of this will likely be published. The work on crisis pregnancy centers we're aiming to finish in the next month. Abortion Rights Canada, Coalition of Canada, is working on a related report on the websites of crisis pregnancy centers across Canada. That'll be released at the same time at the end of October. And then our broader dig into hospitals will either inform our future research, or we might write it up as a standalone report. But this is kind of where we're sitting at. Did I miss anything else, Pratika and Olivia, that we want to mention before we just turn it over to discussion?
No, I think that is about it. for me anyways.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for listening. And I guess I'll turn it back to Anna to moderate us through the second half of this
Great.
hour.
Thanks so much. Ian, Olivia, Pratiga, thanks for the work you're doing for the research. It's really useful, helpful. Thanks for the great work.